Hello there, my name's Geoff Kirby. I was born in 1939, just 2 weeks after the start of World War II. I don't think that was a coincidence. I don't think Hitler was particularly trying to stop me being born, but it was a very dramatic period at that time. The government didn't know how serious the German war effort was going to be in the early days of the war. We were expecting serious attacks on London. So they decided that, at least in London and some of the other main cities, all the pregnant women, like my mother, had to get on a bus and go to the home counties to be delivered. So my mother was taken on a bus along with about 24 other pregnant women out to Bedford. And I was born in Bedford, which has annoyed me rather because as a Londoner, I should have really been born in London. And had I been born in London, I would have been within the sound of Bow Bells, and I would have been a Cockney. As it was, I was born in Bedford. 2 weeks after my mother gave birth to me, she was bundled back on a bus with loads of other screaming children and mothers and brought back to London. And I spent the rest of the war, the whole 6 years of the war, living in London, living in North London, very much exposed to the bombing, the V1s, the V2 missile attacks. And I have memories from about 1943, 1944 onwards.
Lovely.
How about that?
Lovely, that's great. So tell us what you remember about bombing raids.
Well, my first memories would have been late in 1943 when London in particular was being intensively bombed. And I remember standing out in the garden as a small child watching huge numbers of German bombers coming over. I was allowed actually to sit on the top of my air raid shelter in the garden, the Anderson shelter, and look out for German bombers. During the first part of the war, people were very nervous. As soon as the air raid siren went off, they all scuttled into their shelters. But as the war grew on, they became very blasé, and they didn't go down into their shelters when the sirens went. They would stay in until there was actually some perceived danger. So I was allowed to sit on the top of the air raid shelter as a small child, watching out for any danger. If I saw a large number of German bombers heading towards me, then I knew this was imminent danger, and I would shriek a very loud whistle, which the neighbours all heard, and they would come out of their houses, scuttling into their shelters, including me, and my father would put the wooden door into the shelter to protect us from the bombing. But if I saw the bombers going off in a completely different direction and there was no danger, I would just sit there quietly watching them. In the later part of the war, we had doodlebugs, known as V1 missiles. And in the daytime, you could see these coming as little aircraft flying very low over the housetops. But the V1 at night had a flame coming out of the back. And I have distinct memories of sitting on the top of my air raid shelter at night, watching out for these little flames coming over the houses and seeing if anything was coming directly towards me. If it was, I was in that shelter pretty quickly, I can tell you.
So let's just rewind us a little bit. How did you know that these planes coming over were German bombers at the age of 3 or 4?
Oh, because the sirens would sound and say that there was an air raid imminent.
So you knew that they must be German?
Yeah, anything coming from the east flying over London would have been German bombers.
I suppose you were about 4 then, probably.
Yeah, that's right. I remember seeing RAF bombs. Oh, yes. I mean, the memories were so intense, though, that I think I started to remember things earlier than children would these days, when it's about 4 or 5, but yeah.
So tell us what it was like in your Anderson shelter.
Well, the Anderson shelter, people came round with bits of corrugated steel and dumped them in the front garden, and then my father had to put the whole lot together, which was quite easy. It was like a prefabricated kit. It gave you some shelter. There was a metal covering, and you put earth on top of this to deaden the impact of any bricks or broken glass that would be flying around if a house was bombed in the area. They were set about 6 inches to 12 inches below the level of the ground, which turned out to be pretty stupid because when it rained hard, the water collected in the bottom of the Anderson shelter. So quite often after a heavy rainstorm, we'd go, when we heard the sirens sounding, go down to the Anderson shelter and find there's about 6 inches of water. And we had to stay in there often quite for long hours, sometimes overnight, with our feet getting soaking wet sitting in these Anderson shelters. They were cold, they were miserable, and the only light that we'd have in there would be just a small paraffin lamp, which gave out very little light at all.
And a bit of heat, presumably.
Sorry?
And a little bit of heat.
And a little bit of heat, but there wasn't very much. I've actually got a photograph of our Anderson shelter taken during the winter in 1944, and you can see it's got about a foot of snow on there, something like 30 centimetres of snow all over the roof. So it did get extremely cold, and this is one reason why people were very loath to go into their shelters every time an air raid warning siren sounded, because quite often there was a false alarm or the bombers went and bombed an area well away from where we were.
So you didn't have bunk set, for example?
Yeah, there were three of us. There was my mother, father and me. My father wasn't called up into the army because he was nearly 50 years old. He was 45 when I was born, so quite elderly. But he was in the Home Guard. So he was either out on Home Guard duty, like Dad's army. He was very much like Captain Bannerin. He was a captain in the Home Guard. There were a lot of similarities there. But if he wasn't on duty, he would actually be in the shelter with us. And so there would be 3 bunks for my mother, father and me. And we would settle down, and quite often we'd be in there all night. So it was really quite frightening. You could hear the bombers flying over, and later in the war we heard the V1 doodlebugs flying over, which made a roaring noise because they had a jet engine on the back. And this was very, very frightening for a small child. And I distinctly remember, for very good reasons, one night when we heard a doodlebug coming towards us, we could hear this roaring noise getting louder and louder and louder. And then when it was almost overhead, the noise stopped. And when that noise stopped, it meant that the doodlebug missile was going to come down somewhere very close by and actually explode. And this one did. And we heard it whistling down towards us. And my mother grabbed hold of me, and I remember quite clearly she was saying, "Oh my God, we're going to die, we're going to die." And this, of course, was extremely frightening for me as a small child. There was a massive explosion just outside our shelter, and we heard bricks and we heard glass smashing and all sorts of noise going on, which showed that the explosion had been very close to us. We couldn't get the door open of the shelter at first because there were so many bricks piled up outside. But in the morning, the fire service came round and freed us from our shelter. And then from the first time, we saw that the house had been very, very badly damaged. We couldn't live in it. Most of the roof had been destroyed and all the windows were blown out. And there were actually holes going from one room to another. So the damage was really quite substantial. So that's the sort of memory I have.
So if you'd stayed in the house, you probably wouldn't be here.
Oh, if we stayed in the house, we would have been dead. There's no question about it. But when I was in the shelter, the one thing that certainly came to my mind and worried me was the fact that in the rush to get there, I'd left my teddy bear behind on the bed.
Oh, no.
Yeah, and of course I was worried about this, and while my mother and father were going out and looking at the damage to the house, I was in my pyjamas and slippers going into the house, treading over broken glass, bits of brick and things like that, searching for my teddy bear.
Did he have a name?
He had a name. I think he was called Timmy, as far as I remember. Although that may be the name of the rabbit. I can't remember. And I still have the teddy bear, and I can show him if anybody wants to see him as well. But I found him, and he was laying on my bed. I still have him, yes.
But you found him in the rubble?
I found him in the rubble on my bed. If I'd been on the bed, I would have been killed by all the bricks falling on the bed. But I've rescued him. He was a little bit damaged. His glass eyes were smashed and he lost his squeak. But I've rescued him and I still have him 85 years later.
That's amazing. That's extraordinary, isn't it? And so you actually were trapped inside your air raid shelter though, were you?
Yes, we couldn't get out at all because of the bricks that had fallen against the wooden door. Even though my father was kicking for quite a long time trying to open the door, we were just covered in the rubble from the house, the way the house had been damaged.
So you had to wait and be found?
We had to wait until the morning when we were found by the fire brigade, who were going around checking if people were still in their shelters and trapped. So, yeah.
That must have been quite nice to have got out at that point.
Well, the blast of the explosions often blew the paraffin lamp out, actually. And then we'd be fumbling around in the dark trying to find the matches, trying to light it. Quite often we just had to sit there all night in the dark because the matches had got wet because it was so damp in the shelter, or maybe we'd dropped them into the water that was laying in the bottom of the Anderson shelter. So it was pretty miserable, being in your pyjamas, maybe your dressing gown if you had time to grab it, pair of slippers, and spending all night in a shelter in the garden.
It was a close shave, wasn't it?
Yeah.
No, I think you had another close shave involving a bomb, but a different sort of bomb.
Yes, the doodle bugs. These were missiles that used to fly like an aircraft, but unmanned. There was nobody in it piloting. And they were sent across from Holland, mostly a place called Peenemünde in the border between Holland and Germany. And they were built there and they were fired across the channel towards London. And they were like modern drone missiles, which unfortunately we've become very familiar with in the Ukraine and so on. And they would fly at about 500 miles an hour with a flame coming out of the back nozzle, and you could see them coming and you could hear them coming. And one day there was no air raid warning, and I was setting off for school, and I heard this noise, this throbbing, roaring noise behind me, and I looked up, and there was one of these missiles coming over the roofs of the houses straight towards me. I looked back and my mother was standing at the garden gate going, come back, rather more flowery language than that, saying, you'll be killed. But when I saw this missile coming behind me, my instinct was to run. Now, the missile would do about 500 miles an hour. I could run at about 5 miles an hour, so there was no way I was going to outrun it. Luckily, it passed over my head at about the time that I got to my school. And there was the teacher standing at the outside of the school, getting all the children in from the playground as quickly as she could. And we all had to dive into the classroom and go under our desks, and we would sit under the desk with our hands on our heads. Now, I'm not sure that would have protected us if it had hit the school and the whole school would have been destroyed by one of these missiles. But we felt safer with our hands on our heads with a desk above our head. Unfortunately, that missile carried on and came down somewhere. I thought it was in a swimming pool somewhere, and I was told that a very large number of children had been there swimming and had been killed. So this was really very sad incident. But it was very common in London during the war that a lot of people would be killed if one of these missiles or just an ordinary bomb came down on a school or a hospital or anything like that. Completely indiscriminate bombing.
And then there was a third experience with a bomb, wasn't there? A small bomb.
Ah, yes, you're talking about my adventure with the incendiary bomb. Now, incendiary bombs were quite small. They were only about a foot, 18 inches long, and about the size of a cocoa tin in diameter. And they were full of a chemical called white phosphorus. And these were dropped in huge numbers by aircraft. One aircraft could carry hundreds of these little small bombs, and they would drop them on cities. And when the bomb hit the ground, it would burst open and the white phosphorus inside would catch fire. And the idea was to try and burn any buildings that had survived the bombing. They were used very much in Japan, because in Japan, in Tokyo in particular, a lot of the houses out there were built of wood, unlike our houses, which are more substantial. Well, you used to hear these incendiary bombs coming down and rattling on the roof sometime, and most of them didn't actually set light. But one day I discovered one down the end of our garden which hadn't set light, it was still live, and I thought, oh, I think I'll hang on to that. And I took it indoors and I hid it under my bed. Well, of course, my father and mother didn't know anything about this.
What were you thinking?
I was thinking it might be an interesting souvenir. We kids, we were always after souvenirs. And if an aircraft, a German aircraft, crashed on nearby Hampstead Heath, where I lived, all the children would rush up there before anybody else could get there to try and get a piece of the aircraft as a souvenir. And a friend of mine actually got a dagger which was being carried by one of the German pilots, and it had a German swastika on it, and we were all very, very jealous of him for getting this, but most of us usually finished up with just bits of fuel pipe or something like that as a souvenir, which we'd take back home and keep. Well, on this particular occasion, I decided this incendiary bomb would be a useful souvenir and be amazed to show this to my family. Of course, the danger was that if I accidentally dropped it in the house, it would go off and burn the house down. Well, I suppose it was under my bed for about a month before my mother, who didn't actually spend much time cleaning because she had other things to worry about, she cleaned under my bed and found this incendiary bomb under there. Told my father, who was in the home guard. He immediately went mad. He grabbed this thing very carefully and carried it into the garden, carried it over with loads of sand that we always had around to put out fires, and called the local ARP, the Air Patrol Wardens, to do something about it, and it was taken away. He then decided he was going to deal with me. And he made me bend over, he took my trousers down, and he hit me really hard, quite a few times, with his slipper. And I never forgot that. And I never did it again. I was lucky to get away with that.
Let's move on to what food was like when you were 4 and 5. What did you
Okay, well, food was obviously in very short supply. In Britain, as today, we can only supply about half of all the food that we need. And so because of this, we had to import food even during the war. Now, a lot of foodstuffs, luxury things like oranges and bananas, you never saw during the war. The first time I saw a banana was when I was 8 years old. Somebody gave me this thing, and I didn't know what it was. It was long and yellow, and apparently I walked all the way home from this friend's house carrying this banana, like with my hand out in front of me, not knowing how to eat it. I didn't realise that you took the skin off for a start. Nobody told me that. I'd never seen a banana. And we never saw oranges and a lot of things like chocolate. Chocolate is made of cocoa. That comes from Africa mostly, or South America. So some things during the war you just never saw and you could never buy.
The children would have never seen a banana for 5 or 6 years.
No, that's right. No, I mean, it was about 1947 before I saw my first banana. And I think somebody said I wanted to keep it as a souvenir of the war, but of course it soon would go brown and disappear. So the government had to do something about this, and they introduced rationing, where everybody was given a ration book, and this set out how much food you were allowed to have. And it wasn't very much. But the great thing about rationing was that everybody had to have a ration book, even the King and Queen. And we had a lot of admiration for the King and Queen, because not only did they eat the same food that we were eating in the same quantities, but at the beginning of the war, the government had told the King and Queen that they wanted them to go to Canada, where it was safe. And the King and Queen said no, they weren't going to go to Canada, they were going to stay in England. They were going to stay more or less in London, and more important than that, they were going to stay in Buckingham Palace. And everybody was full of great admiration for the King and Queen, George VI and his Queen Elizabeth, because they were doing this, and they were prepared to make the same sacrifices with rationing as we were all making. The rations were worked out so that nobody starved, but nobody had too much food, too many surplus food. There simply wasn't any surplus food. And they worked it out that a man should have somewhere about 2,000 calories a day, which these days is not very much. Nowadays a man would expect to get 2,500 or more. But rationing was very fair. But it was also very strict. When you got your ration book, you had to take it to your local shop, and the local shopkeeper would put his name on the front of your ration book. And that meant that anything that was rationed, controlled by that book, you could only buy from that shop. And if you went in there for your weekly egg, 1 egg a week was what you're allowed. Sometimes the hens didn't lay, so there were no eggs. You go into your shop, he doesn't have any eggs. Can you go up the road? He's got eggs. No, not allowed. By law, you have to buy all your ration stuff from that one shop. So it was very strict, and anybody caught stealing food or getting more food than they really wanted, they would go to prison for 6 months. That was the law. So extremely strict.
There's a story about a rabbit, isn't there?
There is a story about a rabbit, yes, my little rabbit. I can't remember the name of this rabbit, but he used to sit in his rabbit hutch fixed to the wall outside the house in the back garden. We used to feed him with vegetables because there was always plenty of vegetables during the war. They were never rationed. So you always had more of the cabbages and carrots and everything that you wanted. In fact, in 1940, people were growing so many carrots that the government had to destroy 500,000 tonnes of carrots. It's just too many carrots. So my rabbit never went hungry. But if there was an air raid, sometimes the rabbit hutch would be blown off the wall and smashed, and we'd find the rabbit hopping around the garden. Well, round about 1944, my father said to me one day, "Look, little Geoffrey, I'm afraid there's no meat in the shops. We're going to have to kill and eat your rabbit." I thought, oh no, couldn't do this. But it had to happen. And my father took the rabbit out.
Were you very upset?
I was very upset, but I think at the time I was more upset because my father said I couldn't watch him killing the rabbit. So that says a lot about me, perhaps. But yeah, I was upset that they were going to kill the rabbit.
Was it a big rabbit?
It was quite a big, plump rabbit, yes. As I say, there was never any shortage of vegetables to feed the rabbit. He was more plump than we certainly were. So my father took the rabbit out of his hutch, held him by the ears and gave him a few karate chops on the neck. The rabbit was killed. My mother skinned it, took the skin off and cooked it, and we all sat down and ate my pet rabbit. And that was our meat for the week. So, very sad.
But did you enjoy eating it?
Oh, it was delicious. I have to say, we did enjoy him. Yes. No, food.
Not too many tears then.
No, not too many tears, I suppose. I mean, the reality. I mean, we're seeing so much death and destruction in London. Every time you go out of the house in London, you'd see houses that have been bombed recently and people wandering around trying to find somewhere to live. So we were used to death and destruction. I've seen dead bodies during the war, and it became just part of life that there would be this massive destruction after a big bombing raid. Sometimes the Germans sent hundreds of bombers over in one go, and the bombs would just be exploding all around us almost continuously for perhaps an hour. And you'd go out afterwards and you'd see houses that had just been recently bombed. You'd see furniture out in the street all smashed up, and occasionally you saw dead bodies laying around, and this was part of life. So losing my pet rabbit was really not such a traumatic event as it might otherwise have been.
Horrific for a 5-year-old to be confronted with sights like that.
Yes, yeah, it was, but we children, we had quite a lot of fun. As I've said, if ever an aircraft or something crashed on Hampstead Heath, which was close to us, the children would all run up there and start tearing bits off of it as souvenirs and running away before the ARP wardens arrived to shoo us off. There was also fun as well, but a lot of bomb sites were converted into reservoirs for holding water. And there was one bomb came down just 4 houses down from us, which is where a lot of the damage to our house was caused. And so they built a large concrete reservoir there, which was filled up with water, and this was the emergency water supply in the event that the water mains were destroyed by a bomb, which quite often happened. And we children used to love this. We used to throw stones and mud and things into these water reservoirs, which wasn't very hygienic. We used to sail little boats around on these water reservoirs. So that they were a source of fun for us. They never thought about the fact that this was once a house, somebody's home, which had been destroyed, and probably people had been killed there. So the children had quite a bit of fun as well during the war. Yeah.
Now you tell us about running to school to escape the V-bomb that was coming towards you. What was it like at school?
Yes, I don't remember very much about the school. I started school in 1944. I remember that the teachers were very kindly because unusually I had my father at home with me because he was quite elderly, but nearly all of the children at school, they didn't have their fathers at home. Their fathers were away in Europe fighting the war. And so the teachers I remember the teachers as being very kindly, but they were all female and they were all quite elderly. And I've actually still got a class photograph from 1945 showing all us children there with a very elderly lady who was teaching us at the time. Because a lot of the young women got called up as well as the men in the war. People don't realise this, that being called up to serve during the war was actually compulsory for women who were of good health and quite young and didn't have children. So there weren't very many young women around, and there certainly weren't very many young men around. And my memory of school was that it was very boring. You learnt things. You just learnt how to do your tables. You learned how to write. You were never encouraged to imagine stories. You just had to sit down with a book and do your sums and do your spelling exercises, and you would get smacked if you didn't. I remember on one occasion, I must have been about 6 years old, 7 years old. I don't know what I'd done. I was probably quite a naughty child in those days. But I remember being made to stand on the teacher's table in front of the whole class. I was wearing shorts, and the teacher hit me quite hard several times on the back of my leg with a steel ruler. And it was so bad that you could read the marks of the inches on the wound that was left on my leg. And all at playtime, I became the centre of attention because all the other children huddled round to see this mark on my leg where the inches had been engraved into my skin by the violence of the beating. So beating was a part of everyday life in school in those days, even for children sort of 4, 5, 6 years old.
And you would have cried, presumably.
Oh, I cried all right. That was the whole point. You were beaten until you cried. Yeah, otherwise it wasn't being effective. So, and the other thing I remember about the school was that it was old. It was probably built in Victorian times, and it didn't have electric lighting. It was all gas lighting, and it was a great thing to become the gas monitor for the day. If you were the gas monitor, you were given a long, thin candle called a taper, which was lit, and you then had to go round with this and light the gas in all the lamps in all the classrooms. You pull the chain down, which would start the gas coming out, and then you put the flame up, and it would go little pop like that, and on would come the gas light, a very very faint orange glow, which you could hardly see to write or do your sums with, but that was all they had, no electricity at all. So,
would that have been the same in most places, do you think?
I think it would in those days, yes. Certainly in London, the schools were quite old. Quite a lot had been bombed, of course, during the war as well, by the end of the war, and had to be rebuilt as modern schools. But I think it was probably the case that a lot of the schools there were only gas lit. I had a great aunt who I went to visit in the last time I visited her was about the 1980s, and she lived in a cottage in East London, out near Leytonstone, and she had no electricity. She only had gas. She had gas lighting, and she had a gas cooker, and that was it. No electricity in the house at all. But she had a radio, and the only way she could use this radio was to have a great big battery, which I remember was almost the size of a suitcase. And she'd have to connect the radio to the 2 terminals on the battery to get the radio working. So life was quite different in those days.
And so your friends at school weren't evacuated to the country?
No, very few of them were. I think in total, over the whole of Britain, about 3.5 million children were evacuated in the first few months of the war. But it was never compulsory. And my mother and father, for some reason, didn't want me to go away into the country. They wanted to keep me in London. I think they thought that the bombing was not going to be as dangerous as it turned out. So, yes, my school was quite full. Very few of the children I was friendly with went away to be evacuated. Evacuation was not always very successful, though. A lot of children came back from their spell of being evacuated saying they had a really miserable time. I mean, some children, they went away to the countryside. Places like Weymouth had hundreds and hundreds of evacuee children, and most of them probably had a good time, but some of them were treated very, very badly. They were made to work, they weren't given very much pocket money. And one thing that people may not realise is that if you lived in the country and you had a spare bedroom, the law said you had to take an evacuee children if asked. And if you refused, you were fined quite a lot of money, or you could be sent to prison for several months. So some of these children were ending up in homes in the countryside where the people didn't want the children, they didn't like children, and they were quite badly treated. So it may have been a good thing that I was never evacuated, that I stayed in London with my mother and father. We'll never know. We'll never know.